Hey listeners, Kurt here. Just wanted to apologize for the sound quality on my end on episodes 40 and 41. I had a strange issue that I did not notice until after we had recorded, and unfortunately my sound quality suffers. I believe I've fixed the problem for future episodes, but again, I apologize for the poor quality on my end in 40 and 41.
Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 40, An Easy Thing, by Paco Ignacio Taibo II. And welcome to Point Blank. My name is Kurt. Joining me, as always, here's Justin.
Howdy, folks.
Howdy, Justin. Viva la revolucion.
Si, viva. Viva Hector Belascoran.
Yes, I feel I need to say that based on what we're talking about today, which is, of course, An Easy Thing by Paco Ignacio Taibo II.
He's an author who's never very far from the Mexican Revolution.
Correct. And we'll get into that later in this episode, but certainly one who's very closely tied to basically all of 20th century Mexican politics.
Yep, and literary culture. He seems to be at the center of a whole lot of happenings in Mexico, and it's sort of interesting to have him as part of our discussion now that he's actually part of the government there.
Yeah, which is a really strange twist, as we'll get into when we talk about his biography and everything.
Totally.
It does definitely speak to the changes in Mexico over the last couple of years. We will get to that, but first, Justin, I got prepared for this episode today. This morning, I was listening to a little bit of Mexican punk rock music, which seemed appropriate. I think Paco would, approve of that.
No, he certainly wouldn't disapprove. What? Any particular bands that wooed you?
No, I wasn't paying that close of attention to the bands. I just went to Spotify and pick some random playlist. The playlist was a little too emo for me, but there was some good stuff in there.
Sure. Did you note that this was our 40th episode? You did. You must have, because you said it 3 times already.
Yeah, that's right. It is episode 40. We've done 40 of these things, which is, on the one hand, seems very surprising that we've gotten to 40 episodes, but on the other hand, it seems like we've been even doing it longer than that.
Yeah, I would agree. I remember that first year when we started in 17, we were talking about if we make it to 10. And our format was a little different then. We were doing 1 episode per novel and moving forward. But since then, and since we adapted our format, things have really, it seems they've sped up. And we just raced up to 40. And now 50 is very much in our sights.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think we'll have to do a special episode at episode 50. But at episode 40 here, one of the things I wanted to do is if you're new to the show or you haven't listened to every episode, take a look back at those older episodes. It's hard for us to tell exactly who is listening to what episodes or whatnot, but we do get an idea of how many downloads we get per episode. And surprisingly, one of those episodes that hasn't been downloaded that much is Megan Abbott's Queen Pin episode.
Huh.
Isn't that surprising, Justin?
Yeah.
Of the contemporary books, it's probably the one that we've praised the most or brought up the most, certainly.
Yeah, I really wonder why that one wasn't as popular, given that it's a current author. We gushed over the book, and I think we had a pretty riveting conversation about it, but I wonder if it's just because we had dipped away from the classic old school, detectives from the 30s and 40s, and not as many people were exposed to it. It is a conundrum, though.
Yeah, it's quite possible. But if you, or maybe some of the listeners knew that it was a contemporary book and are saving it, but it's a very quick read. It's a good read, and one I think if you're listening to this show, you're going to enjoy. So just a thought, go back into that back catalog and check out some of these books, especially seemingly underappreciated Queen Pin, because I think you're in for a treat.
Damn straight.
So, Justin, to celebrate our 40th episode, I have mixed myself a Wisconsin-style old-fashioned, which I'm enjoying here.
Oh, brandy, huh?
Yes, brandy old-fashioned sweet.
Very nice. That sounds delicious. I'm on my annual January cleanse, so I'm sticking to lettuce and water. We'll see if the conversation is better or worse than usual.
Well, just pretend it's like, I don't know, gin in solid form.
24 ounces of gin. That's the Taibo special.
No, that would be Coca-Cola.
Yeah,
straight up Coca-Cola.
And Cuban cigarettes, yeah.
That's right. Well, anything else new with you, Justin, before we move into the main episode?
No, we're in between things. The past few episodes, I haven't loved reading, and I think I reached a point of burnout for a few months where I just too much reading in my career and with the podcast and my personal life. And over the past month, having a break was helpful for the holidays, but I've recharged and I've started to look at stacks of books excitedly instead of, with a hint of depression. So here's to the start of a year refreshed and ready to read an incredible amount of quality literature. So, and this is the last of our stops around the world. This is the end of this pretty much year-long journey around the world. And, that's good. I feel like we did a solid job, but I'm happy to come back to the States and revisit some pieces that we might have overlooked. It's been a while.
Yeah, that's a good feeling to be excited about your reading again. And I know I've had maybe not as intense, but I've certainly had the same feelings. It can, when you're reading for a deadline, it can get, a little tiresome here and there. But here's to a new year and new books and new journeys on the podcast, I guess.
Cheers.
Before we move on, I did want to mention I picked up a reference book here. It might be interesting to some of our readers. It's Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, 1950 to 1980. It's edited by Andrew Nettie and Ian McIntyre. This is sort of a continuation of a book I mentioned earlier. That was Girl Gangs, Biker Boys, and Real Cool Cats, Pulp Fiction and Youth Culture, 1950 to 1980. But this one covers some of what you could loosely umbrella term books that went around, obviously, revolutionary type fiction. For listeners to this show, there's a section right at the beginning about Chester Himes, who we've discussed multiple times on the show.
Mm-hmm.
There's also books in here about things like the Angry Brigade, the rise of feminism, Black liberation movements, books like, stuff about Shaft or Dog Soldiers. This is it's a good overview of things a lot of things you probably never heard about, but it is somewhat limited in its scope. But I think it's a nice taste of some of these straight to paperback books that dealt with a time period and issues that, maybe we don't always think about anymore, and certainly covers the time period which is somewhat relevant to our author today, Paco Ignacio Taibo. So although it doesn't really cover Mexican fiction of that time period, I will say that. It's mostly English language stuff. So, but anyway.
I had a question. Is that a one long essay, or is it several or a dozen chapters focused on particular aspects of revolutionary crime fiction?
Well, this is basically a collection of essays. There's almost 24 contributors to the piece. There, like, say, the section on Chester Himes is Survival Mode: The Crime Fiction of Chester Himes.
All right.
Just to pick a couple of random ones: Young, Hip, and Angry, Pulp Fiction, and the Campus Revolt.
Are the chapters written by different authors, or are they both written by the editors?
No, they are written by different authors.
Okay.
However, the editors do contribute somewhat heavily to the work.
All right, cool. That sounds great.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff in here. That's Sticking It to the Man from PM Press.
Cool. My brief introduction of An Easy Thing. Man, this was a hard book to summarize, and I'm sure I left a few things out because in the spirit of Mexican noir fiction, and Taibo especially, these are some convoluted plots with a lot of pieces, and sometimes I don't even know what's going on, but I enjoy the ride anyway. So if I miss anything, Kurt, that's obviously essential to our discussion, let me know. We can bring it up at the end of my brief review. Sound good?
Roger that.
Alrighty. So, Ignacio Paco Taibo II's An Easy Thing. This is his first book of this series that was released and translated into English and published in the States. There is a first book in the series that is in Spanish, and it has not been translated. So that's unfortunate. I searched for that one, and I realized I was grasping at straws after a while, unless I went back to class and became fluent in Spanish, which I did not do. So the book version that I read of An Easy Thing was published by Poisoned Pen Press. All right, so here we are at the end of our noir trip around the world, back in North America, in one of the largest megacities in the world, Mexico City. And here we have a crime novel that is both very modern and sophisticated to some extent, but also a progeny of Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles. There is California hard-boiled fiction seething through these pages with a sheen that's very Mexico. Our main character and series lead is Hector Velasquez Shane. He's a detective, independent detective, and he has a backstory that we don't get tons of because I think some of it was in the first book, which was not translated. But we do know that he was once a married middle-class engineer and that he gave up that life for a certificate in detection from a Mexican correspondence school, and that the shabby life of a detective for hire became the life that he leads now. And it's an interesting one, and he's a very, very, to me, interesting detective. We get his past woven throughout the story via letters from his ex and interactions with his siblings in the wake of his mother's sudden death. And I really liked how Taibo incorporated this backstory. He does it expertly in a way that keeps the plot moving forward. It doesn't feel like the obvious author intrusion to tell something that we need to know. It felt, to me, relatively seamless. So, the co-main character of the story is Mexico City. There is so much of the city in these pages. And if you've heard my reviews in the past, you know that I like my place. I want place to be very present in my crime fiction. If it's not there, I feel like there's a missed opportunity. And that opportunity was certainly not missed by Taibo, who is a bittersweet enthusiast of Mexico City. He's lived there most of his life, and he seems to have a fascination with it that matches or mirrors my own fascination from afar. Each page is saturated with exhaust and smog and police sirens and taco stands and sweat and sadness and hope. And while I feel deeply that Velasquez is an avatar for Taibo, you can tell just by the way he describes himself and his habits, the amount of soda he drinks and the amount of cigarettes he smokes, etc. This is as much a series about Mexico City, I believe, as it is about Detective Shane, who himself on page 52 says, "Man, I love this city. It's magical, you know? I mean, where else? You never know what crazy-ass son of a bitchin' kind of thing is going to happen next." And that's pretty much a good summary for this book and the others I've read in the series. About the plot. It's a meandering plot, and it incorporates several interweaving cases, all of which we are introduced to in the first 20 pages, and they all speak to different aspects of Mexican sociocultural life. The first is a search for Emiliano Zapata, the famed folk hero and leader of the Mexican Revolution, who is rumored to be alive and hiding somewhere outside Mexico City. Here we see Taibo's history and anthropology pedigree on clear display. He's been a professor in history over some core aspects of his life. This case is told to Shane in the first pages by an old man, and it moves the detective who, quote, longed to see the heroic Zapata, now 97 years old, charging up the avenues of the city on his white horse, feeling the wind with his bullets. This case is the most whimsical of the three that we receive in those opening pages. The second is brought to him by a former soap opera starlet named Marissa Ferrer, who wants wants his help in preventing her daughter's suicide. This thread leads him to learn of threats against the daughter from some, mysterious men, and opens up this whole convoluted plot that we'll get to later. The third is brought to him by the Santa Clara Industrial Council, who wants him to investigate the murder of Gaspar Cerulli, an engineer and unliked personnel manager at the Delex Steel Corporation. Here we get some labor versus capital sort of themes, and we get to see Hector's reactions to building labor antagonism in the wake of this murder. So the big question at the beginning, once we receive these three story threads, is how do they connect? Or do they at all? We find out Shane is rather perplexed, though he's more excited about the cases. It seems he thrives on the chaos. He actually recalls an old maxim from his pirate father, quote, "The more complicated, the better. The more impossible, the more beautiful." I love this because I agree. But I wondered how it would play out in an actual hard-boiled story where we sort of want to see something come together at the end. This is classic Taibo in the stories I've read. He creates big, complex, chaotic problems and tries to figure them out, sometimes more successfully than others. He's a romantic and revolutionist who thrives in the weird and impossible hallucinations that typify a literary understanding of Mexico. At least that's how I see him. So, here we go, into the story. He wants to find Zapata, he wants to protect the daughter from bullies, and he seeks to ensure that the workers at the factory are not framed for the murder. He has ethics and a code of conduct not unlike Philip Marlowe, and though his means of going about his work are a bit unpredictable, he's never unclear about his convictions, which is interesting to me. Velasquez takes a liking eventually to Marissa Ferrer's daughter, and with the industrial men, he makes his opinion clear. If you're looking to have the union take a fall for the murders, I don't see why you came to me. The cops ought to be more than willing to set that one up for you. He makes sure that he will do the work and take the money, but not compromise his convictions. All through this story, there's themes of anti-authority and questioning and recognizing the blatant corruption of the police forces in Mexico City. And as he navigates the streets, trying to seek out clues and figure out what's going on and how to solve these cases, these conversations he has, sometimes with himself, sometimes with others, all point to Taibo's very strong political views. I think that Shane is a delightful protagonist. He's as much compelled by dreams and dead ends as he is by classic clues. So if you're looking for something that's very clear-headed and Agatha Christie-like in terms of solving this case, you're going to be disappointed because there's a lot of surrealism, magical realism, I would say, to some extent, and general playfulness in this narrative that, can surprise, but could also feel, if you want a straight-up story, like a waste of time. So, keep that in mind. In one scene, our detective, evoking Marlowe, declares, "Time to sharpen your 45, noble knight. Velasquez to the rescue." This is an ode to Chandler and sort of reminded me that this was a hard-boiled novel. You can sort of lose track of that at times as you are hanging out with Shane, wandering the streets, trying to figure out what his thought process is. Because at times I sometimes wonder if Taibo is simply making it up as he goes along without any attempt to create some kind of tight-knit, well-crafted mystery plot. Though, ultimately, at the end, it works for me. I feel that despite the confusion at times, the way the story unravels and the heat heats up as he confronts the murderers and the bullies and gets close to finding out whether or not Zapata is real or not, I was personally captivated by the story. And though I couldn't tell you with a gun to my head how the hell it ended exactly, I'm still like, even when I reread it, I'm like, how did we conclude this? It's like, I don't know, it's almost like I'm in a dream when I read it, but it's a dream I like to be in. The author of a blog entitled His Futile Preoccupations refers to Velasquez as this: "Scarred and one-eyed, Velasquez is a marvelous, intriguing literary creation, and certainly deserves a place in the fictional detectives Hall of Fame." And I have to agree. You may not like his politics or his unorthodox approach to detecting, but one thing to me is very clear. Velasquez Shane is one of a kind. He's one of the only detectives who behaves in the way that he behaves. And in a genre where copycatting is commonplace and invention is incredibly rare nowadays, it's refreshing for me to have an original detective like this. So because of the weirdness of the story, I would say it's not a flawless story, but I would give it 4.5 hits. But I'm going to say 4.25 for now, and because I think there's room for improvement.
Well, Justin, I have to say that I pretty much agree with you on this one, but you also stole some of the choicest quotes from the book that I had highlighted as well. So I think that I think that illustrates that they're good ones. But boy, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm going to just flat out say that for me, this is probably a 4.5 book.
Good. I was wondering. I thought you were. I had a feeling that you were going to come back and go like, man, I just don't get this guy or something. And I was sad because I love Taibo. I'm all over his fiction right now.
Yes, and that's a good point to make, because I think this is a 4.5 for me, because I'm going to admit it is influenced by the fact that I am really liking Taibo as a writer and as a personality. And maybe that elevates my rating on this book a little bit. But you know what? I don't care. That's fine. Maybe if I was trying to be objective and review this for what I'm guessing would be an average listener, maybe I would go to 4 or 3.75 or something like that. This isn't going to be for everybody. That's just clear. But I love it. I love the literariness of it. I love as you called it, the sort of magical realism of it, the surrealism. This is the kind of crime fiction I really enjoy. And it makes a lot of sense to me that I like this, because the afterword we both read the same copy, or same printing rather, of this book. There's an afterwards by James Salas. And I really enjoy James Salas's work, and it has a lot of the same elements. A lot of literary crime, a lot of dreamscape type stuff, a lot of that style. It also was reminiscent to me of Ken Bruin a little bit, and I think that's because his work are so literary and so sort of wrapped in culture and myth, as well as Taibo's work is. It just, one's in Ireland and one's in Mexico. But the other thing that really grabs me about this book is the ambition of it. As you said, it's a detective who acts like no other detective I'm familiar with. And I would imagine that if there is a detective series out there that has a similar detective, it's probably been influenced by Taibo's work with Hector Shane. There's essentially 4 mystery plots going on in this book, and that's all wrapped up in like 220 pages or something.
Oh, sure. Yeah, wrapped up being a complicated term when it comes to Taibo.
That's true. As you mentioned, you have the murder, you have the kidnapping, and you have the search for Zapata, which is like not very connected crimes at all. Plus, you have the family drama of what's going on with his father, and to actually, I think he does each of those investigations justice. And I think that's something that I really appreciate about this. I think this gets into that thing that we really enjoy about tight and terse writing. And he captures that because there's, as you kind of said, this is not your classic mystery where you can put the pieces together and solve the crime yourself. However, the way he goes about his investigation to me seems more believable about how the world works.
I think that's a good thread that you just offered there. The notion that he's existing in the real world, not the world of make believe. I think it feels as if Taibo's trying to incorporate the true chaos, the enlightened nightmare that is Mexico City, and turn that into a piece of work. So it's frantic, it's fast paced. Sometimes it goes full stop. You never know which way something's going to turn, and the least expected things tend to happen. But it all comes to some kind of conclusion at the end because, like it or not, everything inevitably does.
And we can talk about more of this in part 2, but I am really drawn to Taibo's work. I think it, I've already ordered the rest of the books that are available in English. Now the number, that's what's kind of frustrating about him is, for somebody who is so prolific as he is, there's really not that much available in English.
Yeah.
And even the websites, like, Google Translate was not doing me much help here. But even what's available online in English is somewhat troubling. It's even difficult to figure out exactly how many books are in this series, because some sources will say there's 5 and other sources say there's 9. So I don't really know.
Yeah, I think it's around 5 in English, and the rest of them you and I need to enroll in a Spanish reading correspondence so that we can read all the Taibo. That's our new mission.
Yes. Yeah, well, we'll be busy since he has quite a few.
Yes.
But yeah, I've launched right into what is book 3, but the second book available in English, Some Cloud. So I've read that one as well, and I'll try not to confuse the two.
Yeah, me too. That was the first one I read, actually, and I reviewed it in 5 Round a few episodes back very warmly. I want to mention briefly before we move on that An Easy Thing was published in the late 70s. I don't think I mentioned that. But he got his start with his first detective book, I think it's called Days of Combat in Spanish. It was published in the mid-'70s. So this is the era that he starts his career in and continues through to the 80s and 90s. And I'm not sure when the last book was put out, but we'll talk more about that later on, and his politics and his other very busy, very complex life, because he wears many hats in Mexico.
Yeah, that's for sure. But I'm sure you can tell, but Justin and I are both giving An Easy Thing a very strong recommendation. So we would encourage you to take a look at that. It's a pretty quick read and an enjoyable one at that, I think.
Agreed. Forgotten classics?
Is this a forgotten classic? I don't know.
I have no idea. What are you going to be reviewing? I am so excited to know.
Well, Justin, just hold your suspense for one moment longer.
I'm holding my 24-ounce glass of gin in anticipation. It's shaking.
Okay, the question we're asking this week is, Never Say No to a Killer. Is that a forgotten classic? And I think the important thing is, Justin, would you say no to a killer?
I would probably run.
That would probably be the best choice, yeah. This is Never Say No to a Killer. This is written by Clifton Adams. It originally came out in 1956 from Ace Books under the pen name Jonathan Gant. I read the 2017 version from Starkhouse Press under their Black Gat Books imprint. So, Clifton Adams, he was an author who was born in 1919 in Comanche, Oklahoma. He served in World War II in the Tank Corps in both Africa and Europe. And apparently that's where he developed his favorite hobby, which is cooking. And I guess he was trying to make his field rations a little more palatable. You'll be happy to know that in Never Say No to a Killer, we do get a couple of tank references. So he uses that to his advantage in this book.
Woo.
Clifton Adams, he would go on to, he wrote 50 books and 125 stories under the pseudonyms of Clay Randall, Jonathan Gant, and Matt Kincaid. Most of these were Westerns. He won 2 Spur Awards in 1969 and 1970 for his work, and he was voted in 1965 the Oklahoma Writer of the Year.
Huh.
He died in 1971 in San Francisco from a heart attack. During his career, he only did write 5 crime stories of those 50 books, and the rest were all Westerns. The 5 crime stories include When Gods Destroy, Death's Sweet Sons, Never Say No to a Killer, The Long Vendetta, and The Very Wicked. Today we're looking at Never Say No to a Killer, and we're wondering, is this a forgotten classic? And I would almost be tempted to say yes. However, this is basically a rewrite of Horace McCoy's Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. So, with that premise, no, this is not a forgotten classic because he basically rewrote somebody else's book. However, I did read Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, and I actually think that this might be the slightly better version of this story. So what is that story? Well, we have a self-described master criminal, Roy Seward, who is, at the beginning of the book, he's in jail, and he breaks out of jail in a rather violent manner. He's got this all planned out, and he runs, he's supposed to meet a gang boss, gangster type guy, John Vinci. But John doesn't show up. He's not in the car, but there is a car where he's supposed to meet John. In the car, instead, is his wife, Doris. Well, he finds out that John is dead, and she helps with the escape. She gets Roy to a town where Vinci had some power and some protection, and she puts Roy up. And the cost of this is that Roy has to help her eliminate some of her late husband's problems, notably killing a guy named Alex Burton. Well, very quickly in the novel, that's what he goes ahead and does. And as a reward, he receives not only the assistance from his jailbreak, but a pile of documents that will help him blackmail some notable residents of the community. As he's continuing in his get-rich-quick scheme of blackmailing the residents, he also falls for the former secretary and love interest of Alex Burton, Pat Kelso. Well, what could go wrong when you're romancing the former lover of the person that you've just recently killed? I don't know. But things fall apart in Never Say No to a Killer, and chaos ensues from there, and I will leave it to you. Is this one worth a read? Yes, probably I think it is. It's decent. It's relatively short. I pretty much have enjoyed everything that they've picked for this Black Cat book imprint. They're not, everything I've read so far is not like a classic, but it is a solid example of classic crime fiction. And I think that's what you get here with Never Say No to a Killer. And as I said, I think you could call this one a classic if it wasn't such a close rewrite of Horace McCoy's book. And the other problem I have with this is I'm just sick of these classic books where the main character is a criminal who is like supposed to be super intelligent or have a high IQ and then proceeds to do things that don't make any like common sense. They're not reasonable at all. So I'm kind of sick of that trope.
Yeah.
You could do far worse than reading Never Say No to a Killer. So if you're looking for a quick, light read, I think this one would be enjoyable. Just don't expect a true forgotten classic here.
All right. So essentially, you say yes to Say No to a Killer.
You just know what you're getting into.
We need to have a whole new category called Forgotten Semi-Classics.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of what this segment is becoming. I need to do a little bit more research of finding some true forgotten classics to regale you all with.
But the thing is, if they actually are forgotten classics and you love them so much, we probably would end up featuring them as a main dish. So I guess you're in a tough spot.
That's true. I do have my forgotten classic already read for our next set of episodes, but after that, I have a couple that might very well prove to be true forgotten classics. So look forward to that.
Cool. I wish you the best of luck on your quest.
Thank you.
All right. Subject unknown.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown. We're going to start a metal band called Subject Unknown, Justin.
That's it. It's going to be like cosmic noir metal.
Cosmic noir metal. There you go. As if metal needed another subgenre.
I know. It's a subgenre of grindcore black metal and doom metal.
Yeah, so today in Subject Unknown, as we've done with the rest of our Around the World series, is we're going to take a little bit of a look at Mexican Noir. Now, I'm going to premise this right up front and say we've already sort of covered this issue when we talked about Border Noir, so I guess we can kind of try to avoid that part of the Mexican Noir discussion. You can go back and look at our Border Noir episode for that. But what we're looking at here is what is Mexican Noir and what's special about it? What are your thoughts on that, Justin?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up the Border Noir, which I hadn't really thought about. And I remember during that episode we were struggling. What's Border Noir, Borderlands Noir, and what's Western Noir? What does that mean? Is it rurality? Is it people on the edge? What is that? When I was doing my research for Mexican Noir, I realized so much of this definition is really, in large part, about Mexico City.
Yes.
Which is, the pulsing heart and soul of Mexico, arguably. I have a couple sort of overarching things that I pulled out, sort of, what I think are the main recipe or ingredients for the recipe that is a noir in Mexico. I did want to mention that in my research, I came across a pretty cool website by a late professor of geography at Dartmouth. His name was these are initials, G.J. Demko. And he was like I said, professor of geography, but he passed away maybe about, 5 years ago. But he was also a mystery fiction enthusiast. And before his passing, he was in the midst of writing a book on the geography of crime fiction. He was obsessed with the landscapes that were present in a lot of crime fiction around the world. And so what he did, I think probably to develop his own research on his book, is come up with this blog site where he went from country to country and explored the noir of that region, not unlike what we've been attempting to do on this website, on this podcast the past few months, and tried to sort of pinpoint what is that noir and how does it relate to the land and such. So he did this, of course, with Mexican Noir, and He offers a very nice summary, and I want to present the first paragraph of what his summary contains right now. He writes, "Crime fiction in Mexico is a very unusual genre in that it is a literature of pessimism and anti-heroes. The first Mexican mysteries appeared in the 1940s and 50s, but the great explosion in popularity occurred in the 1970s and 80s. Mexican writers were and are heavily influenced by American writers such as Hammett and Chandler, but have also developed a distinctive style of their own. True to the Hispanic mystery tradition, police and authorities are distrusted and considered corrupt. Societal disorder or chaos is assumed to be the normal condition, and the heroes, or rather anti-heroes, are not obligated to restore order, but rather to parody and satirize its absence. Frequently, the mystery is turned upside down and the police or authorities are the bad guys, whereas the criminals are the good guys. Mexico City, the federal district, is overwhelmingly their setting for Mexican stories, but Mexican writers have a distinct gift for describing the settings with skill and color." I'm going to stop there as a general summary and see what your thoughts are on that before we dive deeper. How does that sound to you based on what you've read and thought about on this topic?
Well, I think that's got to be pretty accurate from my reading experience. And I would have to also second this Landscapes of Crime blog, I guess you would call it. I've looked at it a number of times, including the Mexican entry, and I think it's unfortunate that he passed away before being able to finish this work, because I think it would have been a pretty interesting book to take a look at.
Agreed.
But I think there's a lot of similarities here in what we saw in Brazil, as far as that idea, the pessimism and the anti-heroes, the government and police as bad guys, and that is pretty accurate to the history in Mexico, and we can get into that a little bit, especially as we look at Taibo's history. But it's been at times and continues to be on some level a very corrupt state, and that's an issue that many people within Mexico are aware of and actively fighting against. But it makes sense that is kind of what's coming through in the fiction. And I can't really disagree with anything in that paragraph. I think it's a pretty good summary of my experience so far with Mexican noir fiction. And I do think as we've said multiple times here, we're limited a little bit in the scale of what's available in translation. But what we've sort of surveyed is certainly reflective of these statements by Demko.
Totally, and it's general, but. I think it's pretty clear in defining, giving certain parameters to what Mexican noir is, though I think there is bleed over into a lot of magical realism fiction in Latin America. And that's one thing that I don't think Brazilian noir had. I think that's the one distinction I would articulate, is that in the Brazilian noir, yes, the corruption was clear, and this distrust of authority because of obviously historical reality. But there wasn't as much magical realism. There wasn't as much Gabriel Garcia Marquez and all of that stuff that rose out of the rough times of the 60s and 70s politically. And I think that bleed over is very apparent, at least in the Taibo stories I've read, if not other pieces. I know that there's a piece by Yuri Herrera, a story that I read. It's actually a very short novel, and it's called, oh man, I don't remember the name, but it came out just a few years ago, and it's about a border crosser who has to cross and is delivering something for a crime boss, and so that helps them secure their passage across the border, and they make it to Texas. But the story is so damn surreal and abstract, and that blends well with the very like neo-realistic border crossing, and it just was reminiscent to me of magical realism. And that I read that before I read Taibo, so it's pretty clear to me, at least in my limited experience, that is a strong piece of this overall pie of what noir in Mexico is. Unless you have anything to add here, it'd be interesting for us to maybe run through, when did it start? Who are the players outside of Taibo? Because it seems as if nobody's ever written noir fiction in Mexico before, outside of Paco Ignacio Taibo. That's how it feels sometimes when I'm reading the bountiful literature on him.
We're not understating how big of a name Taibo is for Mexican crime fiction. I mean, he is quite literally the rock star of Mexican crime fiction. I mean, This is an author, and we'll get into this in a bit, but I mean, hundreds of people show up when he speaks. Everybody has been influenced by him since he has started writing, basically. So, but yeah, let's look at a couple of those early Mexican mystery writers, and I have here that, interestingly, the first piece of Mexican mystery fiction dates to roughly the 40s, but we don't actually have, according to the research I did, we don't have a date of publication on this particular book, but it's called, it's by Alfonso Quiroga, and it's...
Oh yeah, I have that here.
Okay.
Via y Milagros de Pancho Reyes, Detective Mexicano.
Yeah, which...
something in miracles of Pancho Reyes, a Mexican detective. What is via?
Vile.
Not... Oh,
so
like the vileness in miracles. Or something?
Yeah, I think so. Like the Mexican mystery fiction might be quite dark from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly.
The first one we can actually put an actual date to is in 1944, and that's Rudolfo
Usigli, I think.
Usigli?
Yeah.
Okay. Ensayo de un crimen, which is, I believe that's the trial of the criminal.
Uh-huh.
So, and he was a professor. That was the only crime fiction piece that he published. But one of the things that is credited by, again, we're going back to Demko here, is there was a proliferation of like true crime magazines in the 30s and 40s in Mexico. And then that kind of led into more of a crime fiction scene coming out of that as the demand for those stories led into more fictional short stories and stuff like that. So that's where we start getting a real build of that into the 50s and 60s.
And in the 50s and 60s, we get, we have an author named Jose Martin de la Vega, put out a collection of short stories, which is cool. We don't talk about short story collections very often on this podcast, and I think we should. If we can find some good ones, we should do that. But in the case of De La Vega, he put out a collection featuring Peter Perez, a detective de Perobio y Anexas. And in these cases, he solves crimes that the police cannot. And this is sort of a deliberate, like, fuck you to the cops kind of thing. He criticizes the police, the ruling political party, and government corruption. So if people are questioning whether or not this thread of, questioning and critiquing the government is not a thing in crime fiction for very long, that's not an accurate assessment. It started with the first mystery and seems to be all the way through up into the 60s, and we do have the first female Mexican detective or crime fiction writer, as far as I know, again from Demko, is a woman named Maria Elvira Bermudez, who is a lawyer and a novelist, and she put out a bunch of stories, including one called Diferentes Razones Tiene la Muerte, and this came out in 1987, and also Muerte a la Raza. And she had a series of stories that were Agatha Christie-like, a journalist, which is not sort of far from where she was as a lawyer and critic, using deductive skills to solve criminal actions in Mexico in the 1970s and 80s. So that gets us closer to the modern era, or at least the era that we were alive in. What's next? Any big names prior to the Taibo insurgency?
Well, we do see a number of crime stories coming out from other authors who, didn't necessarily make their name in crime fiction, but, dip their toes into crime fiction. There's a couple of interesting things here where we have Carlos Fuentes publishes a book which in translated in English is called The Hydra Head, which is sort of a espionage tale. And we also have one here that was apparently influenced by an author named Brunel, El Complot Mongol, where the hero, detective of Jewish and Mexican descent, battles Mexican oil among a number of foreign enemies. So that's sort of interesting that early on here we have, well, actually we'll see later on that this battle for resources in Mexico is a common theme in the fiction. But that was from the 70s. And then I think now that we're strongly in the 70s, we can start talking about Paco Ignacio Taibo, who now pretty much maybe we'll just come back to him, skip him for a minute, but he's going to start dominating the scene in the 70s.
Yes, and he sort of, yeah, we'll talk about him. But the other writers who were writing in the 70s and the 80s, and then some more modern folks include, let's see here. The 70s appear to be an era when a lot of the crime fiction was per demko, quote unquote, characterized by a lack of solutions to crimes and emphasizing the inequality of Mexican society. So just like the culture-wide critique of modern society was happening, so too was that happening in the crime fiction of the time. Names at this time include Vicente Linero, Jorge Abargüengoita, and Jose Emilio Pacheco. Among folks who came in the 80s in the wake of that sort of insurgency of critical, societally critical detective fiction include... Oh, one thing I wanted to mention about these stories that some of them also started to include elements of surrealism, which, evokes Marquez, who was writing in the 60s and 70s. And that feels as if it makes sense to me in terms of literary history that would start to feed into noir fiction at that time. But even Carlos Fuentes, who is, a Mexican legend in the literary scene, more for his literary work than for anything like crime stuff, even he wrote a espionage novel called Cabeza de la Hidra. During this time, Paco comes to a head, and we'll talk about him in a moment. But in the wake of Paco, in the modern era, there are some novels that I've really loved and valued, and some that I'm really excited about reading. One of them is written by a guy named Martin Solares, came out in 2010, and it's called The Black Minutes. And this is just one example of, I think, what is a fairly flourishing crime fiction scene in Mexico, based on what I've read.
That's one I've read, and I'll be doing a review of that in 5-round bursts.
Oh, that's terrific! I'm really excited about it. The reviews I've read of it look pretty terrific. So, but do we want to just focus our energy now on Taibo and his contributions, and move into a bit of a bio on him, because he's just pouring off of these pages.
Yes, I think we're talking around it enough, and I think we've made the point that Taibo is really the person to talk about here. And I think if we're going to summarize Mexican noir, like outside of that border noir, narco noir kind of thing, I think we can say that it exudes a lot of sort of anti-heroes, a sense of pessimism, and often the deeds, the crimes go unpunished, especially when they come from the government end. I think that can be a bit of our summary of what we'll see in a lot of Mexican crime fiction. But yeah, let's look at Taibo. Who this is our new title for this. Who the hell is Paco Ignacio Taibo II?
Can I quote something here from an article in The Nation about his rise to political ascendancy in the wake of the most recent, the wake of AMLO's election in Mexico, the radical left. He's more like a democratic socialist who's the current president of Mexico. Anyway, he brought Taibo into his cabinet to serve as the head of the Foundation of Economic Culture or something like that. That's a bad English translation. But here's a quote from the article talking about his ascendancy. On a recent Thursday night, thousands piled into Mexico City's Palace of Minings to attend, of all things, a book festival. Neither books nor mines were the main attraction, however. Just inside the doors, in a chandelier-studded ballroom, some 36 reporters and a half-dozen network camera crews awaited quietly for the 70-year-old writer Paco Ignacio Taibo II, who had recently been appointed to run the storied Fondo de Cultura Económica. So, thousands of people came into a room to wait for him to talk about essentially his plans for cultural events and book publishing in Mexico, which, can you imagine that happening in the States?
No, I honestly cannot. Yeah, I read that same article, and we're unlike some of our more recent authors, we have a wealth of information. The amount of things that he's been involved with is is somewhat staggering, to be honest. That as you quoted there, like here we have this author of this celebrity, but let's just take a step back for a moment and just do some bare bones biography on him. He was born January 11th in 1949 in Spain, actually. His family was of sort of the socialist anarchist background of Spain, and if you know something about Spanish history, you'll know that this is post-Spanish Civil War. His father fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans. And it's surprising to me that it took until the 50s where his family had to flee from Spain under Franco's regime. I'm actually surprised it didn't have to happen before that.
Yeah, totally.
Like many Spanish folks who were on the Republican side, they found their way to Mexico. And Mexico was accepting a lot of the refugees from this experience, and that's where he ends up at the age of 9. Now he's been a nationalized Mexican citizen for a long time. He's married to Paloma Saez is her name. He has a daughter, Marina. He's written 80 books, although that number is even somewhat hard to pin down. He says it's 80 books. Other places say it's 50 books. We'll go with what he says. It's 80 books. He says he has 40 more books in him. We'll see about that. He's considered an intellectual, a historian, a professor, a journalist, a social activist, a union organizer, and a writer. That's a little bit of the bare bones of it. Well, let's start a little bit with his sort of political background, because it's impossible to separate Paco the writer from Paco the political activist. The two go hand in hand. He lists his political influences as Che, Salvador Allende, Pancho Villa, Emilio Zapata, and Lazaro Danas del Rio. Is that how you say his name?
Cardenas?
Cardenas? Yeah.
I think.
One of the more progressive presidents of Mexico. He's strongly influenced by the left, and not to get into that too much, but it flows through all of his writings. I mean, this is a guy who has written the definitive, in most people's eyes, biography of Che Guevara in Spanish. And it's quite a tome. He's written biographies of Pancho Villa.
Yeah, I picked up his book on Che, and it is a tome. It's a very thick book. It was a bestseller, and like Kurt said, it is the definitive biography of Che in Spanish, which is quite the feat given his bounteous influence in Spanish-speaking cultures. But the English translation was very successful as well, and I'm looking forward to reading it. That was turned into a film that was on Netflix. It was turned into another film that came out a while back. But that's just his historical elements, his interest in history and anthropology, and obviously radical political theory. You can see how it seeps into his work. He doesn't. While he is all these things, you could put him in all these different boxes. You can see very clearly that all of it bleeds through one of the X. He doesn't separate his interests. He allows them to cross-pollinate in his fiction, like the book we're going to be reviewing today in next episode, An Easy Thing, in Some Clouds, in his Hector Velasquez book which he co-writes with Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista Liberation Army. He infuses all of his books with history. He talks about Pancho Villa and explores his relationship, Pancho's, to Mexico culture. Talks about Zapata in An Easy Thing. He regularly references his dads, or maybe Hector's dads, because Taibo essentially is a thinly veiled Hector.
Yes.
Velasquez it's so obvious that that's the case. You see these backstories in the books about his dad in Spain, who was an anarchist fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and what's autobiography and what's fiction. It's very hard to tell in Taibo's work, and I think that's one of the reasons he's so endearing to the masses in Mexico. Yeah, and beyond Mexico.
Yeah, and that's a point that is no small thing. That's why you get thousands of people to show up for this, basically PR event about the government publishing wing of the government. I mean, here's a writer with all these books. He's won 3 Dashiell Hammett prizes for crime fiction, and he's won multiple books of the year. That Che biography that you mentioned has sold at least 500,000 copies. He's considered the founder of the neo-political genre in Latin America. He's the president of the International Association of Political Writers. He was one of the founders of the International Crime Writing. And here he is as a political appointee, but yet he's still very much a writer and a person like sort of the people. Like, and I don't think that's not an act in his case. That's just who he is. You know, he goes to this event that we're talking about with all these people, you know, that he's described as, you know, he's a short guy. He's 5'4". He's wearing baggy jeans, an open work shirt, a faded t-shirt, clutching his bottle of Coke that apparently he drinks 3 liters of Coke a day, and his cigarettes and his Cuban cigarettes. And people go up to him and they want to, you know, they shake his hand and give him little presents. And he seems to, you know, he seems to be very much an everyday guy, despite all of these awards and accolades. And I think that says a lot about a person, especially at that stage, that late stage of your career, where maybe other people would step away from that a little bit.
Sure, you could see people who have succeeded in the ways that he has step away and sort of hole up in their mansions and feel like they've done enough. But Taibo doesn't do that. And you said you mentioned that along the lines that he's a man of the people, and that can't be overstated. He is not well liked by the literary elite of Mexico. And what I've read, they have sort of rejected him as one of their quote unquote brothers or comrades. He has never tried to play up to the elite cultural, reaches in Mexico. His interest is in the people. And in that event that I quoted earlier in the Palace of Mining, the reason people were there was because as he was made the head of this state-run publishing house, the point of the publishing house that his mission is to make paperbacks, make writing affordable to laborers in Mexico, because apparently it's very expensive to buy books in Mexico given the given the wages.
Yeah.
Wages are like $12 a day, and books cost $25 or more. People simply aren't going to buy them. And he's created a system where he's going to distribute these sort of, he's going to subsidize book costs to make them like $2 a piece and put them out for the public. He's trying to bring literature to the people in a way that, to me, I mean, that's incredibly endearing, even from this far away. I can only imagine the effects this type of behavior, this direct interest in the masses would be to folks on the ground there.
I would hope, if you're listening to this program, regardless of what your politics are, you would want reading to be accessible to people. And, just this idea, like you said, it's crazy. The numbers that were in that article is that it costs $25 in US dollars to buy a trade paperback in Mexico.
It's not acceptable. Nobody's going to read.
No, I wouldn't buy that many books at that price. This is a government publishing house, and they also have government bookstores, essentially. They have 30 bookstores. And his idea is to make these more community centers. And again, I think, I would hope, regardless of politics, if you're interested in reading, one of the things you're going to be interested in is in good discourse. And a bookstore, like a library, could be a very good venue for that type of discourse. And, he calls this a republic of readers, which, it's a very noble goal in my eyes. And, I hope this is being a successful program. A lot of the articles that were out there were from his initial appointment. I have not seen how this has been going. But, at the outset, his quote is here. He's talking about the president. The president has chosen the book as the symbol of culture and of political awareness, and our job is to bring books that are cheap or even free to every corner of the country. Mexicans love to read, they just can't afford it.
And if you're still doubting that he's trying to be relatively nonpartisan about this, he makes it clear that the books made available are good books. They're not politically motivated books. He's not trying to proselytize or he says, when someone is moved by something they read, it's usually not a newspaper article or even a magazine piece. It's a book. Robin Hood, The Grapes of Wrath, No didactic pamphlets from Lenin or Trotsky. And Das Kapital, this book is so dense, it's the best way to get people to quit reading forever. His interest is in motivating people, drawing them into the world of literature, not scaring them away with some kind of political dogma. So I love that he's doing that. I do hope that it's successful, and it would be, I think we should keep our eyes on how that's looking over there in Mexico.
I mean, obviously he has his politics here, but this is also fostered. We didn't really talk about his family yet, but he comes from a literary family. His father, who he shares a name, his father Paco Ignacio Taibo. He was a writer, a journalist, a playwright in both Spain and Mexico. His brother Carlos, he's a writer, an editor, and a professor of political science. His other brother Benito is a writer and a poet. I couldn't find a lot about his mother, but his mother's name is Marcia Carmen. You can tell a lot about people, I think, from family photos and stuff like that. And you see pictures of Taibo and his family if you do Google image search, and they look like a family that really enjoys spending time with one another. And that that I can imagine that fostered this quite huge literary tradition in the Taibo family.
That's cool. Anything else about him? He's still alive. He's 71 probably now. So I hope he has a few more books in him.
Well, there is one more thing, and I think we have to touch on this as a fact of Mexican crime fiction, because it comes up in Taibo's writing. It comes up in other writers that I've looked at, with the cultural legacy of the movement in 1968. And Taibo was a student militant at this time. He's a veteran of this movement. He's written an entire book about the effects of 1968. And if you know really anything about modern Mexican history, this is a pivotal moment. This was like the rest of the world. There was huge amounts of student movements going on in Mexico in the late 60s, in 68. And the reason it originally occurred is that the Olympics were going to be in Mexico in 1968, and the government chose to spend millions and millions of dollars on the Olympics rather than domestic issues that should have been addressed.
And these are the famous Olympics where the two African American contestants or participants from the United States put their fists in the air in solidarity with the Black Power movement. That iconic image. Yeah,
very, very powerful time in the world. And the government cracked down on these student protests severely. And to this day, nobody has been really held accountable to that. There was a particular event, one event, where there was a student protest, and the government started shooting at the protesters. And the government says they killed 44 people. That's pretty much proven to be untrue. The best estimates are they killed 300 to 400 people. And there are hundreds of people who are still considered missing from this time period in Mexico's history. And this is known as the Mexican Dirty War, where the government was essentially at war with its own people and protesters who were actively fighting against the corruption and problems that we see in Mexican crime fiction. Culturally, there's a lot of baggage from that, and we will certainly see that in Paco Taibo's work, because he was there. How could it not be in his work? Shane is also influenced by this event because he was a student at the same time, I believe, in the books. But I think that it's such, that time period holds such a weight in the politics of Mexico through the 70s and 80s and 90s that it has to be, we have to say it.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. It's inevitable that it's going to come up. I do agree. I think that Taibo is haunted by 1968. It's a thread throughout all of his work, through Shane, through his novel, through his work on the Che biography, and through his historical studies, his interest in Mexico revolutionism, and his whole past history, sort of coming from this radical family. I think all that helps, but to be in that moment, to bear witness to atrocity and to the raw power of the state attempting to crush a liberatory movement, like I think he probably thinks about it on a regular basis, and like you said, it influenced that whole generation and shaped the literary, intellectual, and artistic work that came out of Mexico the past 30 years.
Yeah, I'd like to close this with something that is said by James Salas in the afterwords to An Easy Thing. This is his opening paragraph referring to Paco. Great writers, by definition, are outriders, raiders sweeping down from wilderness territories to disturb the peace, overturn the status quo, and question everything we know to be true, then gone. Like deranged cousins shut away in the houses of loving families, they are a great bother, an embarrassment, open secrets trembling always at the very edge of violence, out there, just beyond the light of these campfires we call civilization.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, that's it for our discussion or introduction of An Easy Thing, and a little bit, actually quite a lot about Paco Ignacio Taibo II. Obviously a major cultural icon in Mexican crime fiction and Mexican fiction overall. Join us next time when we get in deep with An Easy Thing and we really try to unravel this somewhat complicated novel, but still an exciting one.
Coming up in future episodes, of course, episode 41, I can't wait for that. I don't know how we're going to keep it under an hour, but let's try. The next one after that, we're coming back home, but we're going into the future. We're going to be spending time with Philip K. Dick's infamous Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the foundations for the film Blade Runner. So we're going to spend some time on sci-fi noir for episodes 42 and 43. And then we're going to go back to some old school. We've been away for a while, and we have not touched base with the reasons why we started this podcast, which is because of our interest and love for the early hard-boiled, the early detective, and the early noir fiction that sort of captured so many hearts and got us into this genre. And so we're going to spend time with Richard Stark's The Hunter. Richard Stark is a pseudonym for Donald Westlake. And The Hunter is a very well-known early work of his featuring an anti-hero. That got turned into the movie, which is very similar to the name of our podcast. So that's going to be 44 and 45, and we'll leave it at that. How do folks contact us, Captain Kurt?
Well, you can always find us on Facebook, Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. Best way to get in touch with the show is to email us at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. And you can also find us on Twitter @pointblanknoir. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Adios.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.